It wasn't the knife. It wasn't the gun. What made him terrifying was the teacup. Graham Young was only a teenager when he discovered his obsession: poisons. Not the kind you read about in fairy tales, not distant myths of assassins in history. Real poisons, measured in grams, grains, and doses. The kind you could stir into a cup of tea without a second thought. And what followed was one of the most disturbing killing sprees in modern British history, carried out not with violence, but with patience. To understand Graham Young, you have to go back to post-war Britain. Born in 1947 in Neasden, London, Graham's childhood was shadowed by tragedy. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was still an infant, leaving his father struggling to care for him. Graham was sent away to live with relatives, and though he later returned to his father's household, those early fractures shaped him. He was intelligent, but also isolated. He didn't fit in with other children. While they played football or traded comic books, Graham retreated into books. And not just any books. He had an insatiable fascination with chemistry. By the age of 13, Graham was not just interested in science. He was obsessed with toxicology, the science of poisons. He devoured every textbook he could get his hands on, memorizing lethal doses of arsenic, thallium, antimony. He knew how they worked, how they killed, how the body would respond minute by minute. But what made Graham different was not just the curiosity, it was the desire to test it. He wasn't content to learn about poisons in theory. He wanted to see them in action. It began, as it often does, with small experiments. Graham brewed concoctions, dripping drops of poison into pet food bowls to watch neighborhood cats fall ill. He poisoned mice, watching their spasms and documenting each symptom in a secret diary. For Graham, it wasn't cruelty in the traditional sense. It was study, detached, clinical, as though he was writing a school report, only his subjects were living creatures. But very quickly, animals weren't enough. Graham grew bolder, and his own family became the next subjects of his experiments. His stepmother began to feel ill, nausea, stomach cramps, weakness. His sister collapsed at school one day, doubled over in pain. Even his father complained of mysterious bouts of retching and dizziness. Doctors chalked it up to common ailments: food poisoning, stomach flu, stress. But behind closed doors, Graham was recording everything. His diary contained meticulous entries: doses, symptoms, adjustments for the next time. The way most children might track the growth of a plant or the feeding of a goldfish, Graham documented his family's suffering. It was not emotional for him, it was scientific. He was running experiments on living human beings, people who trusted him. By 1961, Graham Young was no longer experimenting in secret. His tests had escalated. He had a plan, and his first target would be the woman who had stepped into the role of his mother, his stepmother, Molly. Molly was kind, patient, and welcoming. But she had also become Graham's focus. Over weeks, he laced her tea with antimony, a poison that caused crippling stomach pains. She grew weaker by the day, and Graham watched it all unfold, making notes as if she were no more than a laboratory subject. On April 21st, 1962, Molly collapsed violently after another cup of tea. Within hours, she was dead. Doctors believed it was natural causes, possibly a heart attack or complications from an undiagnosed illness. To everyone else, her death was a tragedy. To Graham, it was a success, his first real kill. Molly was not the only one. Graham had been spreading his poisons across the family. His father suffered intense stomach cramps, barely able to move. His sister Winifred nearly died after fainting in class, the poison coursing through her system. Graham's cruelty wasn't impulsive. It was systematic. He adjusted doses, observed reactions, then altered his formulas. He was turning his family into unwilling participants in his private science experiment. Every symptom, every collapse, every fainting spell was carefully logged in the pages of his diary. He didn't just want them sick, he wanted data. At first, no one suspected the quiet, bookish boy, but Graham's behavior began to give him away. He spoke openly about poisons with classmates, describing in graphic detail how they worked on the human body. He bragged about which toxins would kill fastest, and even carried vials of chemicals with him. When his teachers noticed his obsession, they grew uneasy, and when his relatives continued to fall mysteriously ill, questions began to mount. Finally, in May 1962, the pieces began to fall into place. After Molly's death and the continued illness of the family, Graham's science teacher discovered bottles of toxic chemicals in his school desk. Alarmed, the teacher contacted authorities. Soon, police raided the young home, and what they found confirmed their worst fears. Graham's room was a miniature laboratory. Shelves lined with poison bottles, carefully labeled, detailed notebooks documenting doses and symptoms. Experiments tracked like a scientist, except his test subjects were his own family. When questioned, Graham spoke calmly, almost proudly. He explained the chemical reactions, the dosages, the effects. To him, this wasn't murder, it was study. He seemed almost pleased that the police had finally discovered his work. He showed no remorse, no guilt, no fear, just fascination. It was this cold, clinical detachment that made investigators realize they weren't dealing with an ordinary teenage delinquent. Graham Young was something else entirely. At just 14 years old, Graham Young was convicted of poisoning his family and sent not to prison, but to Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital. Doctors warned he was dangerous, pathologically obsessed with toxicology. One psychiatrist wrote, "This boy has an insatiable desire to kill." The world assumed Graham was safely locked away. His dangerous experiments finally stopped. But what no one could predict was that Broadmoor was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning. After being caught in 1962 for poisoning his family, Graham Young was sent not to a traditional prison, but to Broadmoor Hospital, one of Britain's most notorious secure psychiatric institutions. There, he was just a teenager surrounded by some of the country's most dangerous offenders. Doctors diagnosed him with a personality disorder mixed with extreme obsessional traits. To many, Broadmoor seemed like the perfect place to contain him. But Graham was clever. He played the role of a model patient, compliant, polite, studious. He read voraciously, charmed psychiatrists, and convinced them he was rehabilitated. What they didn't see was that he was refining his obsession, not curing it. He studied toxicology in greater depth, memorizing the effects of rare compounds, and waiting patiently for his chance to try again. In 1971, after serving just 9 years, Graham was deemed safe enough to release. The psychiatrist who signed his papers could not have known that they were unleashing a far more dangerous man than the boy who had entered. Upon his release, Graham found work as a laboratory assistant in Hertfordshire, a job that conveniently gave him access to chemicals. It was the perfect hunting ground. Soon, his colleagues began experiencing mysterious illnesses. At first, it was subtle: stomach pains, dizziness, headaches. Just as he had done with his family years before, Graham carefully logged every symptom in a private notebook. But he escalated quickly. One victim, 60-year-old Bob Eagle, became violently ill and died after weeks of agonizing sickness. The death was written off as natural causes. Graham was quietly satisfied, his first confirmed kill since freedom. Not long after, another coworker, Fred Biggs, was stricken with the same symptoms. His condition worsened over months, leaving him bedridden and unable to function. Biggs eventually died in excruciating pain in 1971, his body ravaged by thallium poisoning. Other employees were struck too, suffering crippling nausea, hair loss, and nerve damage. Graham would watch them at their desks, pale and trembling, barely able to hold a pen, and he would take notes like a scientist charting an experiment. What made Graham's crimes so insidious was their invisibility. Unlike a knife or a gun, poison left no clear attacker. Illness could be mistaken for disease. Death could be blamed on bad luck. But soon, suspicions grew. Too many workers at the company were falling mysteriously ill. Too many unexplained deaths. And there was something about Graham, the young man who loved talking about toxicology, who seemed almost excited when discussing sickness, that unsettled those around him. It wouldn't be long before his past and his present collided, exposing him once again.